Welcome to the second episode of the Data Driven Strength podcast. We have a few questions lined up that we're going to get to just in 1 second. Just a friendly reminder that we do have a Google form linked in the description of this video. Whether you're on Apple Podcasts or YouTube, you can click that link and submit some questions, and hopefully we'll get to it on the show. All right, with that out of the way, Zach, the first question we have is, what are your opinions on doing singles all year long or year round to maintain exposure in practice?
Yeah, I think there's a few different ways we can go with this question. I think overall, I think we would consider ourselves proponents of doing top sets at least year round. But I do think that there is a kind of social kind of stigma of what a top set means in terms of like singles year round sounds like a thing that somebody's talking about, a very specific way of executing that. And I don't necessarily think we need to apply those arbitrary constraints of doing top sets year round. So like when I hear singles year round, my mind immediately goes to like doing singles at 8 year round. And I don't necessarily think that is the best way of thinking about it. I think we can conceptually view this as there's utility to performing sets that are really specific to the event that we want to be good at ultimately, which is the 1RM. And I think so long as your set is within some realistic constraints, the primary one being above 85% of 1RM, I think you're going to get the majority of the benefit of top sets. And so with that in mind, you can organize that in a ton of different ways. That can be a set of 4 at a 9 RP all the way up to a single at a 5 RP. There's a ton of flexibility within that. And I think the factors that are going to be kind of different depending on the person, I think I made a post about this pretty recently, but it was, the individual tolerability, the arousal that an individual approaches those sets with, and just kind of nailing down that recipe to make sure that it's the most sustainable method so that somebody can do it year round without, getting too beat up or burning out as far as motivation. And just making sure that it is a sustainable strategy rather than just thinking, okay, a single at a 9.5 RP is really specific, I'm going to do that all the time. I think there's an argument to be made of sustainability over quote unquote optimality. And then also there, you can probably periodize these things too, depending on kind of what the short to moderate term goal is for that top set, depending on the phase you're in. But go ahead, Josh, riff off that if you want.
Yeah, so would you say it's fair to kind of summarize what you just said as top sets year round are probably a good idea, but they don't necessarily have to be singles? I think that's kind of where we land is why would you constrain yourself to just singles or not singles, right? It's a false dichotomy that is not necessary. When I think you kind of get into those shades of gray, I think most people probably agree that for some individuals, if they can tolerate it, if they're not too tied up in performance, and they're not overthinking their single at an 8 performance and getting super worked up about it year round, and if they can tolerate it, then sure, there's not really a downside, but there's other factors to consider, like Zach mentioned, tolerance, psychology, etc. So I think we would fall somewhere in the middle there in terms of take it on a lifter by lifter basis, as well as a lift by lift basis for that individual.
Yeah, I think I overall agree. I don't think that one is too complicated in our opinion. I think it just boils down to execution. So we won't spend too much more time on that one. We'll hop over to the next question. So Josh, what are some tools like artificial progression? And they kind of point to where we've talked about intro weeks, that can increase athlete buy-in or confidence?
Yeah, so this is actually, I think, a good transition from the previous question as it pertains to top sets, because I think a lot of people will repeat the exact same top set week to week, which isn't incorrect. But at the end of the day, what's the goal of a top set? The goal of a top set is to practice some low velocity repetitions, and these repetitions are slow because of the load, not because of fatigue within the set. So that's really all we're trying to do is get some practice executing slow velocity repetitions that are constrained by load. So with a tool like artificial progression, we can say, okay, at the end of the day, that's really all we're trying to accomplish. There's nothing inherently magical about a single at 8. So what if we just went from a triple at 8 to a double at 8 to a single at 8 over the course of 3 weeks? At the end of the day, the broad stroke stimulus is basically the same, but you're able to add weight to the bar week to week, even if performance isn't increasing week to week. That's kind of a general theme of our stuff, is that we want to detach from week to week thinking in terms of performance. That doesn't mean you don't look at it, but that just means that you don't get too worked up about it, or some of the negatives that can come from overthinking that, like overshooting and then digging yourself a hole. So all that's to say is, at the end of the day, if we can get the stimulus that we're going for in multiple ways, why not do it in a way in terms of a week-to-week progression that will kind of give us the illusion of momentum, and then that can lead to actual momentum and confidence. I think progress seems to be streaky because we find ourselves in the middle of these feedback loops, and these feedback loops can either result in good things or bad things. And when you have this perception of things going well, that's more likely to lead to things actually going well. So if we can kind of get the ball rolling, even if it is artificial, that doesn't mean you're not actually making progress. It's just a way to kind of nudge you in the right direction, and again, get you to detach, which can hopefully lead to, better actual outcomes down the line.
Yeah, I think this opens up to even a broader kind of perspective on how buy-in, confidence, and just the perception of how things are going kind of can influence our outcomes in general. And I think that's why we generally take the approach of, there is these principles that we can kind of outline on paper that we can perceive to be optimal in a vacuum. But I think once we start applying the context of a given individual or athlete, then we start to realize that there are certain things that they just simply prefer, enjoy, and creates a positive feedback loop more often than a negative feedback loop that automatically, in the end, is gonna trend things in a more positive direction. So I think just realizing that, confidence perception of the direction of the training, and then just confidence in general, really does influence our outcomes. I think the more you can start making training decisions to set yourself up for success rather than favoring what you may perceive to be the best kind of organization things on paper. So I just think keeping that in mind is something that is a good kind of just framework to operate from when making overall programming decisions.
Yeah, so just to hop in one last time here, and to kind of mix the two questions we've gone over so far, is going back to the first question about top sets year round or singles year round, as well as this artificial progression, as well as buy-in and confidence, and kind of merging these two. It's just a strategy to potentially consider is, what if we do your single at 8 for this block, or your top set this block, however we're progressing it week to week, whatever it is. So let's just say your top set for this block, using a close variation of the lift just to get you to detach from your performance. What if we did your top sets on a pause squat? At the end of the day, it's accomplishing the goal of what I described earlier, of practicing the motor pattern, practicing slow repetitions that are constrained by the load, but you're not seeing the estimated 1RMs. You're not comparing to past performances. So how can we kind of merge these broad stroke concepts of detaching from week to week performance, as well as practicing these slow repetitions? So I just want to throw that in there one more time. Anything else to add before we jump to the next one?
Sounds good to me.
Cool. All right, so this next one's a little bit long. I'm going to read it verbatim, and then I'll kind of synthesize it. So there are some exercises where the last rep is either still fast or a fail. For me, it's close grip bench press, for example. That means that almost all of those reps are at the same speed. Does that still accumulate the same amount of interset fatigue as slow, grindy reps? So to kind of put that in other terms, this person is explaining that they feel like if they hit a rep, it's fast, or if they don't hit it, it's a fail. So they're saying, how does this tie into some of our stuff on intraset fatigue and velocity loss within a set?
Yeah, this is a really good question. I think, off air, Josh, we were kind of going back and forth exactly kind of how we wanted to frame our answer on this one. But I think there's a few kind of key things I would think it is important to keep in mind on this stuff. So the first thing I'll say is, after having used a velocity unit or linear position transducer for about a year now, the first thing I'll say is that although it may feel like all of those reps are at the same speed, they very likely aren't. And little decays in velocity is very, very hard to notice. I'll do a set of, like a power set of 3 at 70%. And essentially every rep feels the exact same subjectively, but then you look at the velocity loss and there might be like 10 to 15% velocity loss, which is not to say that that is necessarily important in some instances, but it's just important to realize that there is probably some decay that is hard to subjectively pick up on unless it is very, very significant. So I think that's the first thing to realize. And so in our framework, the kind of abiding principle that we want people to try to follow is that you're just trying to minimize that as much as logistically possible. So it's not necessarily that you're looking for a certain number or anything, but there is velocity loss that happens within a set almost inevitably, and you're just trying to minimize that as much as possible within the constraints of your time and how many sets you want to do and all that kind of stuff. The other thing I'll say is that velocity loss at a given intensity is also extremely individual. So, some individuals that are very, very, for lack of a better term, good at, buffering metabolites and all the other aspects that come into, a high degree of velocity loss and be able to sustain that, is going to be different for somebody who isn't very anaerobically fit, let's say, and isn't able to withstand that very much. So the decay in velocity might be way, way more rapid than another person. So I think that's just another thing to keep in mind, is that might be an individual consideration to think about, and that might be just a threshold that you want to stay below, because that is just going to be, rep to rep, that's going to be a much larger change in velocity loss than would be typically as kind of this in a perfect scenario, this linear decay, which I think we both are somewhat skeptical that it's that clean in reality in the gym. But that might just be another individual consideration to keep in mind, is that if you really sharply decay in velocity on given exercises, for strength at least, in the short to moderate term, it might just be a good idea to stay below that threshold almost always for a few weeks or blocks to make sure that you're not getting that very, very rapid decline in bar speed that's going to probably impact the force production of that set, but also probably the rest of the sets for that session as well. So those are the first two things I kind of thought of. Josh, do you have anything to add there?
No, I just wanted to kind of offer a thought experiment to get your thoughts on this, because I don't think I have a good answer for this. So before I proposed this idea and asked this to you and to see what you think, just a quick refresher for everybody. We are proponents of low intraset fatigue training in the short to moderate term for strength. So that means, let's say you're doing a set of 8 with your 10 rep max, right? So a set of 8 at an 8 RPE. We would say as a strength test approaches, instead of doing that one set of 8 at RP8, what if we just did 2 sets of 4 with that same exact load? We think that has, a net positive effect for short to moderate term strength. Okay, so with that out of the way, let's say you have person A who does their set of 8 at RP8 and they get 10% velocity loss. And let's say person B does their set of 8 at RP8 and they get 20% velocity loss. Do you think there is potential practical implications of that difference? So that would basically, I'm basically asking, is person A, can they probably do more reps per set and still get this short to moderate term strength benefit than person B?
That would be my guess. Yes, I think, and this is the conversation I've had with myself many times, is that usually in the velocity loss research, we're using that as an indirect proxy for RPE. is that that's kind of generally the way we use it. We say, oh, a 40% velocity loss, they're going to be training close to failure and thus a higher RP than a group training with 20% velocity loss. But I've had a few conversations with other people that I do think that there is something that velocity loss tells us that's independent of RP. And I think in that instance that you just kind of gave, I do think that kind of demonstrates it to some degree, is that at a given RPE, which is generally not the way we would talk about this in terms of strength, but in that specific example that you gave, if an individual is able to perform more reps at a lower velocity loss, I think that that warrants them to do so, because whatever factors that is, you know, allowing them to do that, some of the speculative adaptations, and I want to make sure I emphasize that, speculative, this is just our best guess to try to justify the longitudinal research. I think the higher percentages of velocity loss, the more velocity loss you're having, the more and more the endurance adaptations kind of seem to take hold. So I think, you know, the difference you portrayed between 10 and 20%, I don't think there would have been a practical difference, excuse me. But if you would have said 10 and 40 at the same kind of repetitions in RP, that would have been, I would say there would definitely be a difference there, just based on speculative mechanisms, again, that we're just kind of theorizing why the research kind of shapes out the way it does currently, which is obviously subject to change. But I do think that, you know, at a given RP, given repetition range, if somebody is able to maintain a lower percentage velocity loss, you're probably warranted in doing more reps. And I think just from a coaching perspective, after talking to a lot of people about some of this stuff, I think that's where part of the, and, you know, we've talked about one of my clients before, Patty, so shout out to Patty. She's able to do an absurd amount of reps at a given percentage, which is very, very typical. And I think this is maybe where the smaller individuals, generally females, can tolerate absorbent amounts of volume. And I think this is part of it, in the sense that it just may be that they, on average, are using higher repetitions per set because, you know, to fulfill this velocity loss kind of threshold that, you know, seems to be not necessarily optimal, but maybe logistically optimal, in the sense that you're accumulating a decent amount of work per set without having to do 20 sets. I think that may be part of the reason, is that they're just able to accumulate more reps without a significant decline in bar speed. And that's kind of been my thought on that. The other thing too is that if you have people that are just slower in general with reps, that'll also probably mess with those numbers a little bit. So it's always hesitant with velocity loss as a metric, just because it's so finicky. And I think we've talked about this after you using a unit for a while now. It's extremely, extremely variable. So I hesitate to say anything definitively, but those are a few observations that I have made that I do think you can take a few things away. So hopefully that was helpful, kind of just riffing on that a little bit.
Yeah, really quick, just to finish up with this question. I would definitely second that it is finicky. Like, it's not as clean cut as you might expect, in terms of, okay, I'm gonna load up X percentage of my 1 rep max and do, you know, 3 sets with 15% velocity loss. It's like, it's important to remember that a lot of this research is done on Smith machines. And
I was just going to say, that's a strength of the research. So in practice, it might be less useful to some degree, but in research, that is probably a strength.
Yeah, like for example, I've noticed on deadlift, the way I break the floor on the deadlift can influence the speed significantly. So it's important that just because a repetition is fast, which we would generally, you know, at that given load, if it's faster, that's a good thing. We would view that as. But you can manipulate technique in a way that is actually disadvantageous for your training goals, to get that higher velocity when actually to have a more specific, you know, joint angles and movement pattern. It would be better to stick with the slower velocity with different execution. So basically all that's to say is it is finicky. It's not super clear cut. So I didn't intend that example or that question to be like a practical scenario. It's more of just a thought experiment. So again, just to wrap up, and a potential take home for how you can conceptualize our position on this and potentially apply it for yourself or for your athletes, is that we think a repetitions short to moderate term strength stimulus is more or less defined as the velocity you can move that repetition at in relation to the maximum speed you can move that repetition at under no fatigue. So let's say you have 80% of your 1 rep max on the bar. If under no fatigue, you can hit that repetition at 0.4 meters per second, and you hit that at 0.36 meters per second within a set, we would say that's a better strength stimulus than if you hit it at 0.32 meters per second. Again, that's just a conceptual kind of framework to consider. Again, it's finicky. It's not always clear cut in practice, but hopefully that helps clarify our position.
Cool. So we'll roll into the next one here. So Josh, do you ever program pivot weeks or blocks? Do you think they are useful or important for resensitization to training?
So I'll kind of start out with my practical application of it, and then we'll see if we go down the resensitization rabbit hole. In practice, I view them almost exclusively as a psychological tool. That's not to say there isn't a benefit in terms of physiological or a muscle-centric view of resensitization. But the way that I decide whether to implement a pivot week or pivot weeks is almost always just by asking the individual, hey, do you feel like you need a week off from our normal training week? Do you feel like you need a week off from the competition lifts? Do you want to do some walking lunges, which when you haven't done a single leg squat variation in months? That's the way that I view it. Is how can we kind of hit the reset button and reapproach training to ultimately have a better progress down the line. So I'll kind of stop there, and again, I view it almost entirely as a psychological tool, and I think you can just decide whether to implement it by asking the athlete, hey, do you feel like you need a break? Do you feel like you kind of need to detach for a week?
Yeah, I think real quick, let's kind of define what pivot weeks are. So pivot weeks are essentially a concept derived from reactive training systems, which we take a lot of information from, and those guys over there. So shout out to RTS, always putting out great stuff and really thought-provoking information. Essentially, what it is, it's in their system. So they have developmental cycles and pivot cycles, or pivot blocks or weeks. And the idea is that the developmental cycle is a training block designed to improve short-term strength and really, really dedicated towards that. And then a pivot week is essentially to hit on all the stuff you missed, which may be like some hypertrophy work, stuff like that they may not have gotten as much focus in a developmental cycle, but also to really vary the training stimulus so that when you come back to a developmental cycle, using exercise selections and protocols that the athlete typically responds well to, along with exercise selection, that's a fresh stimulus. It's not like you're running pin squat single at 8, 5 sets of 5 at 70% for 24 weeks in a row. There's some variation in there, so that when you do come back to maybe a similar protocol on pin squats, you feel fresh again. So maybe that features alternative stance squats and deadlifts and some really long eccentric work and just a ton of different exercises that you may not use typically. So it's essentially just a week or a block in which the training stimulus is varied widely. In some circles, they believe that's going to offer a physiological benefit, but I think all circles believe that there's a psychological benefit to be had. And I think I would definitely echo what Josh said, as I primarily view that as a psychological tool, in the sense that if someone is feeling burnout or just needs a mental reset, that is something I'll very frequently kind of use to kind of kickstart the engine again and try to get people, get the fire and the engine lit again, so that we get back to normal training and get things kind of going in the direction we think is going to be best for them in the long run again. I think one thing I've been using recently that I've been calling reload blocks. So it's kind of the opposite of a deload block. It's kind of in the middle of these two things. It's not totally a pivot in the sense that I'm intentionally trying to vary things widely, but I also kind of am using maybe an exercise selection and strategy. Generally, this is kind of like coming off a meet or something that maybe the style is a little bit different for 4 to 6 weeks or something like that, just to kind of, change up the structure, whether it's a different template, maybe they're using upper lower for a while instead of full body. And you could view that as just a normal kind of programming change. But I do think that having some blocks that aren't the exact same in structure is helpful in some instances too, for additional psychological reset, or just to, just keep things fresh as far as the motivation perspective. As far as the resensitization question, that's kind of the second half of this question. I think we both agree, Josh, we can speculate on this for hours, but as far as hard research, we don't have much to go on. I think there's a solid rationale for it as far as a theoretical case to resensitize some mechanisms of muscle growth and stuff. But again, that is all really speculative, and we don't have any hard data on that to really be confident in approaches. And I know some coaches have used it very successfully. I know, talking to Kalen, our intern, he and his coach, Joe Stanek, have used a resensitization block, sounds like pretty successfully, for his bench press, I believe. It's been definitely used in practice, I think, to get some pretty good effects. So just the question is why, and I don't think we really know. But I don't think that a psychological reset or a psychological benefit should be downplayed to how meaningful that can be to benefit the training going forward. So that's kind of my 2 cents on that question. Josh, go ahead, clean it up, wrap it up, whatever you think there.
Yeah, I have a couple things I want to add real quick. So another practical application of something like a pivot week that I've found myself using actually quite frequently, especially recently, is just using them as like an exploratory period. So if you have some ideas that pop up during the training cycle in terms of exercise selection that you think might work well for the individual, but you want to get the all clear before actually implementing it in a training cycle, let's go ahead and run one of these pivot weeks or exploratory weeks and see how the individual likes it. And similarly, I'll often give somebody, squat/quad exercise of choice or deadlift variation of choice. And if they've had their eyes on something for a while, go ahead and try it out. And then, hey, let me know if there was anything during this pivot week or exploratory week that you really enjoyed and that you might, you think we can include in the coming training cycle. So again, just kind of like an exploratory period, just detach from normal training and try some other things out. I view it mostly as a psychological thing as well as a practical thing. And then going back to Zach, you kind of mentioned like these reload weeks is, I think you can use a lot of the excellent ideas that Reactive Training Systems puts forth when they describe their pivot blocks and stuff. And I don't want to mischaracterize them at all, but I think you can use a lot of their ideas and implement them in other ways. So, for example, I just wrapped up my current training cycle, and I'm not going to do a full pivot week. I'm just going to go ahead and do a very conservative intro period into the next training block. But this next training block is going to be less specific. I'm still going to low bar squat. I'm still going to sumo deadlift. I'm still going to bench press, but I'm probably going to be doing those main lifts at a lower frequency. I'm probably going to have a bit more exercise variation. I might do some overhead pressing. I might do a little bit more arm work, that kind of stuff. So again, it's kind of using these concepts of a pivot week in which I'm exposing myself to, other things that beyond just the main lifts and close variations. And I'll do that for maybe 3 to 5 weeks, something like that, transition into a block that's a bit more specific, and then go from there. So again, it's similar to our first question in terms of singles year round. There's a gray area. You can use all these concepts and implement them as you see fit with each individual. All right, I think we can wrap up there. Zach, I'll go ahead and throw the next question at you. How do you approach a new client, and how do you accommodate for individual differences, such as volume, equipment, etc.?
Yeah, I mean, this is obviously a huge question, and there's a ton of things that go into approaching a new client. But I think the kind of few cornerstones that came to my mind is the first thing is communicating with them to kind of get a gauge of their past experience. What has worked, what hasn't worked, what have they enjoyed, what they haven't enjoyed, and just kind of painting a picture as far as the directions that may be canceled out that you were thinking in your head, or maybe directions that are going to be strongly favored based on their input, and just kind of the options you had in their head. The one thing I will say that we've kind of discussed a few times now, is I think there are certain things that I think are useful to kind of keep standard between new clients, because as a coach, at the end of the day, we are all biased to some degree. We all have our methods. We all have certain ways that we like to view this whole problem of training, and that leads us to come to certain conclusions. But I think at the end of the day, what importantly that does for new clients is that if I'm giving you something that I have never given to anyone else before, and that's not to say things aren't individualized, because I want to make that very clear. They are. But I'm saying, like, for example, a strategy that we often use with new clients are the AMRAPs. I think people kind of know that's something we are pretty strong advocates for. So when I bring a new client on, very likely the first couple of weeks they start with me, they're going to have AMRAPs somewhere between 70 and 80% on the main lifts to like a 7 to 8 RPE. And what I mean by having something standard or something similar between new clients is that allows me to have a reference to say, is this an abnormal case or isn't this an abnormal case, based on my experience and what I've seen. And so that can probably sooner rather than later, it can kind of clue me in on different factors that may be out of maybe the typical norm. So we just mentioned Patty earlier. I hadn't done AMRAPs with her, the kind of the first training cycle that we worked together. And I just hadn't been doing them for everyone at that point when we started working together. And then I had her do them this past training cycle. And what I've noticed is like we've talked about, she is very, very good at doing repetitions at a given percentage of 1RM, to the point where it's something I need to take into account if I ever prescribe reps at a given percentage of our estimated 1RM, because that's very, very important. We've talked about this effective load concept, especially in a low fatigue cycle. If she's performing, 10 reps at a 7 to 8 RPE with 80% of 1RM, I need to know that, because that's going to affect the low fatigue repetitions I would prescribe at that percentage of 1RM. So what I'm kind of getting at is that, you're going to use the individual's past experiences to craft and individualize the strategies you're going to use initially with the client. But you're also going to use some of the strategies that you're really, really familiar with, so that when you come out the other end of that first training block or first couple of weeks, now you have a really, really solid direction that you can use both their past experiences, their preferences, but then also some of the pieces that you've realized for the first couple of weeks of training, hopefully that allow you to see further aspects of individualization that you guys can continue to kind of mold things in the direction you think is going to be best for that individual lifter, which inevitably will end up looking very different lifter to lifter, although it may look pretty similar early on. And then I think just the overarching thing that I think is extremely important is that, especially with new clients, I would say this with all clients, but especially with new clients, communication is absolutely huge. You can't read each other's minds. There has to be constant communications on things the client likes, they don't like, things the coach is seeing that needs additional context. Like, Josh, one thing we always talk about is if a set's below a 6 RPE, sometimes new clients won't even write an RPE down for us in the training log. And sometimes that's something we need to talk about, just in the sense that we kind of want to know where that effort's at, and still getting them to realize contextually that's still an effective set, depending on the context and all that kind of stuff. But it's just, communication is so vital for any coach-client relationship, that I think that is vital and probably the most important thing for a new client, as far as I'm concerned. So, Josh, I was kind of rambling there. Go ahead, work your magic, clean that up.
Yeah, I think the individualization aspect is an interesting topic, because obviously when you're hiring a coach, or you're an athlete and you're looking for something that's going to give you better results or get you out of a plateau, individualization is the answer. So it's a huge part of the training process. It's a huge part of the coaching process. And, generally speaking, I think a lot of lifters, once they get pretty advanced in their training career, I think you can kind of get to a point where the recipe that works for that individual. And at that point, the progress starts to come a lot more reliably. Now, that doesn't mean that you don't change over, the course of years. That's not to say you're not refining, your training cycles. That's not to say that, it doesn't change dramatically over years. But again, that's to say is that individualization is very, very important. However, I think a lot of people, when discussing this topic, they, in an effort to sound virtuous, they kind of make it seem like they start from square one for every single individual. So, and they act like they do not have any biases about the training process. I'm not sure how you can be an effective coach if you don't have biases about the training process. You have to have kind of go-tos in terms of changes you make. So, something that we often do is we look at their old training programs and we see, or what I often try to ask myself is, what is their limiting factor for each lift? Is there a limiting factor that they just don't have enough muscle mass on their frame? Is there a limiting factor that they're not proficient enough or confident enough with the top set? And then we can go from there. So you have to have biases and you have to kind of have this process, but it's not algorithmic and it's not like you're starting from square one. Zach and I talked about this in the first podcast. If this individual truly responds best out of any training program in the world to a conjugate style system, we're probably not going to get them there. And I think that's okay. Now that's, at the same time, you need to be flexible in the sense that if you do bring them closer to what your biases are and they don't respond to it, you can't just keep throwing that at them. You need to deviate from it and know when to deviate from it. So I think there's a middle ground there of having biases, understanding why you think understand what best practices are, and then go from there. So that's kind of my short little rant on individualization. I have one more thing to say, but Zach, it looks like you have something to say. No? Okay.
That was good.
The other thing I wanted to touch on really quick is, and this is almost more important than a lot of other things in the individualization process, is just getting an idea of their background and their influences. So if somebody comes from, somewhere where a lot of the listeners probably come from, follow kind of the evidence-based crowd, they're on board with RPE, they're on board that we don't have to take every set to failure, they're on board with volume is the main driver of hypertrophy, then their program is going to look a lot different than somebody that comes from a different background in which, it's all about training as hard as possible, training to an RP 10, kind of just a different attitude. That also applies to higher frequency versus lower frequency approaches. So all that's to say is I think you have to understand their background because that influences their beliefs and their expectations about training. If you look at somebody's old program and they were, doing a frequency of 1 on every single lift, they probably think that's the best way to go. And if, load management points aside, moving them to squatting 3 times a week, you might not be able to do that overnight. So again, I think you kind of have to leverage those expectations in the training process and just get an idea of what makes them tick. If you have somebody that really needs to feel like they're training hard and we throw, some sessions at them where the session RPEs are going to be, a 3 or a 4 out of 10, that might not be the best way to go. So it's the coach's job to give them, some of what they desire and what makes them tick, while also giving them what you see to be best practices. So I rambled as well. Zach, do you have anything to clean up on my end?
That was good. We're going to cap it there. I'd probably screw it up, so I'm just going to leave it there. We'll go to the last question here to cap this episode of the podcast off. Josh, I'll read this one verbatim. It's also kind of long here. Is your idea of using non-competition movements for the majority of your hypertrophy work and limiting comp variations to 1 to 2 heavy sets influenced by the ideas of greater movement variation for improved motor development in the comp lifts? So if I'm going to kind of introduce this question, try to simplify it a little bit, I think they are asking, is kind of our framework in which we dedicate more of the total training volume to other movements like leg press, hack squat, belt squat, high bar squat, instead of just the competition movements in a hypertrophy phase, is that influenced in part? I would say probably not in whole, because I think that's probably the first thing you would address. But let's say not all of the reasoning, but part of the reasoning is that additional movement variation seems to be related to increased proficiency in the competition lifts as far as motor skill.
So Zach, you might disagree with this. We haven't really talked about this one too much before recording this. I would say no, or at least that's a very small portion of it. Um, on our website, we have a really good article by our friend and Zach's client, Nate Henderson, which you should check out on this topic because he probably portrays it in a much more accurate fashion than we will here, but we'll do our best. Um, I'm not sure. I'm not sure I have much to say besides that, Zach. So I'll let you jump in here. Basically, my answer is no, or at least that's a small part of it. But I'll let you take a shot.
Yeah, I think my understanding on the topic, and I know you and Nate were kind of had to bring me to the light during the review process of this article because I had a very different perspective of this coming in to the article and then a different perspective leaving the article after peer review. So I think my perspective on this kind of topic now is like, so long as you have movement variation to some degree, you're kind of getting the benefits. And there's better and worse ways to do that, obviously. But I think, in the general constraints of a powerlifting program, you're going to be doing those variations that mimic like the competition movements to some degree. So long as there's variation there, I think you're going to get some of the motor learning benefits. So I'm with you. When I'm writing those down, that is, I think it really comes down to the fact that we don't program super hyper specific, and that's kind of the only step we need to take in that direction as far as getting the benefits of motor skill development. We program variations, I would say, fairly liberally, but that's not really the reason I'm picking a specific variation, especially in the hypertrophy phase. That is much, much more so related to the individual's ability to have a strong mind-muscle connection and also have the prime mover of the lift we're trying to improve be the limiting factor of that movement. That is almost always my thought process for a hypertrophy movement for that individual. And for a strength movement, I think you could say that, again, we don't generally program hyper specifically. So we have that kind of box checked as far as variation and aiding motor development. But at the same time, I think we also program the more variations that are more similar to the competition squat, for example, like a pin squat, pause squat kind of deal. I think we program that for some variation, but almost just as much to mix up the psychological ability to compare performances within the week. I think at the end of the day, both of us kind of view that a squat's kind of a squat, and that might be slightly an unpopular opinion, but I think at the end of the day, that's kind of my thought process, at least, is that, a pin squat, pause squat, yes, those definitely have some very little things that they may offer that a different variation might not. But at the end of the day, I'm programming a different variation for psychological, just psychological separations of the training sessions, more or less. And then I'll shift that around based on preference, novelty, and maybe a perceived technique correction ability if I think that's going to help them out. But again, that's not nearly as clean in practice than it seemed on paper in my experience. Like if I have somebody do a pin squat, while I think on average that's going to correct like the chest fall pattern in the squat, but I would be lying if it's as clean as it would seem on paper. So I generally just view that as another variation. And again, so long as that variation box is checked, I think we're getting a majority of the benefits that Nate kind of outlines in that article. And it doesn't seem to be this very specific formula of what the actual components of that programming needs to be to elicit the effects of increased variation for motor development. But let me know if you agree there.
No, I think you said what I was trying to say, or I think you stated my position quite well. So I guess if I would sum that up, I would just say there are almost certainly benefits to not being hyper specific, but just not being hyper specific accomplishes that, right? So to kind of go back to the original question, if I'm programming leg press or belt squats, I'm not really thinking I'm including leg press and belt squats because, for some motor development in the comp lift, I'm programming them because I want them to get bigger quads, So again, we're doing it for other reasons than motor development, but you might still check that box. So that's kind of the way that I think about it. So using myself as an example, I kind of fell on this in my last training cycle because I was dealing with some anterior hip issues in my squat, and I found that when I trained a belt squat, I could work around any of these issues because I just had more ability to adjust my toe angle, my stance width, that kind of stuff, to still get a really good hypertrophy stimulus for my quads, without being under the barbell. So basically, what I landed on in that training block is I worked up to 2 singles during the week, one on Monday, one on Thursday. The one on Monday was a comp single, and the one on Thursday was a pause squat single, and then the rest of my work was belt squat work. And I was able to tolerate that, and I was checking my boxes of skill and confidence with heavy loads on the main movement, and then I was checking the box of a variation that is efficient for hypertrophy. So again, we very well might land on something like you described, in the sense that you're doing 1 to 2 heavy sets on the comp lift or very close variation, and then doing other work that is less specific, but we're just doing it for different reasons. So hopefully that clarifies our position. The last thing I'll throw out there, and first a quick disclaimer, I'll speak for myself here in the sense that I am not an expert on motor control or motor development by any means. However, I am aware of some strong arguments for movement variability, and including that for perhaps injury risk reduction, as well as the way that I would probably describe it to one of my athletes is just being a half decent athlete and being able to bend over, tie your shoes without getting winded. So going back to my example of, as well as Zach's example of a reload block, so doing a short training block after you finish a training cycle as a means to kind of ramp back up into the next training cycle. What if we did a short block with more exercise variation, right? Do some overhead pressing, do some single leg squat work, and just having some movement pattern variability might be a net positive in the end, just to kind of train some qualities that we don't see when we get a little bit more specific. All right, that's all I have on my answer. Zach, anything to add?
Yep, looks good.
Cool. We'll go ahead and wrap it up here. Thank you for tuning into the second episode of the Data Driven Strength Podcast. I guess you could leave us a rating and review on iTunes. That would be
no idea how that stuff works though.
Yeah, we're still figuring this out. If you want to hit the bell on YouTube,
I'm not even gonna say give us 5 stars. I would say, if you want to give us a 4-star rating, that'd be pretty cool, because I realize how kind of bush league this is, but we'll get there, folks. Don't you worry.
And with that, go ahead and drop a question in the description of this video. There's a link for you to drop a question. Yeah, take it easy. Bye.